Welcome to the pod.
Hi,
Hi.
it's great to be back. And by be back, this is our first only podcast,
yeah.
unless, you guys really want us to come back. We're thinking of Pod Save Anthropology as our title.
Yeah, working title, but I think that's a pretty good,
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Let us know in our feedback.
We're working on Crooked Media buying the pod.
Yes, we're trying to pitch it to them. So if you have any connections with Jon Favreau, John Lovett...
They won't return my calls.
Huh?
They won't return my calls.
No, they won't return my calls either. I tried messaging D. Ray McKesson, but he did not answer, so...
It's fine. We'll work on it.
Alas, here we are.
Danny, if you know anybody.
Yeah. Same for you, Ethan.
Okay. So today on the pod, we're talking about Abu Lughod and her writings on Bedouin societies in Africa, and specifically the concept of reciprocity in those societies, and specifically how that affects the role of women in those societies.
Yeah, and we, wanted to preface this episode by kind of discussing our position as, two women from North America who've grown up with very similar expectations and for what the woman's role in society should be, in Western terms, quote unquote, progressive beliefs of how women, should be able to exercise their freedom of speech and their ability to be in politics and in the economy. So, when you're reading Abu Lughod's Veiled Sentiments, it's a pretty stark contrast between how the women in the Bedouin society live to how we live, as women able to go to college at GW and live pretty equal lives to our male counterparts. Whereas, Lughod describes a society in which women are very much, submissive to, and how we would describe as, submissive to their male counterparts. I would say that what's most interesting and what's her most important argument is that, these women don't particularly see themselves as submissive to their husbands. This is something that we'll go into a lot more in depth later in the podcast, but it's interesting to see, to note the importance of not comparing how we live to how they live. It's more about understanding the society, and I think that's what Abu Lughod really wants to get from her writing.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely doing the reading and preparing for the podcast. It's definitely an exercise in cultural relativism. We kind of have to check obviously you can't check all your biases at the door, just seeing how these women behave and why they behave that way and what they get in return. So.
And you can kind of think of it in the way that, their society works for them, our society works for us. Yeah. And there are, Lughod doesn't go into too much if there's any movements to change that society. However, the foundations of that society are very much based on this reciprocal relationship between women will take care of the home and men will take care of politics and the economy and all that jazz. And whereas our society, it's more of a equal combination of women doing stuff for families or not having a family, or it's based more on your own personal freedoms and liberties. And that's what works for us, but that's maybe not what works for them. So again, when you're reading the book, it's just really important to come at it from an academic perspective of understanding and, broadening your viewpoint on different cultures. And, specifically as international relations majors, is very important for us. When you go out to actually practice implementing foreign policy, you do need to understand the people that it would then be impacting. So
right.
Very interesting topic. When reading Veiled Sentiments, we both initially picked up on this reciprocal relationship between men and women in their society. And we were immediately able to relate that back to one of the first readings that we did in this class, which was Moss gift giving, in which he described gift-giving economies in the Pacific Islands, specifically the Milne Bay province of Papua New Guinea, and we kind of compared it to gift-giving and potlatch in those societies, and kind of how in those societies reciprocity was done through gift exchange, and how this kind of further categorized their societal interactions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we talk about gift economies, this is kind of a textbook example. Literally is a textbook example.
Textbook example.
Yeah. because by, even if the gifts are just like bracelets or kind of, things that don't have a ton of kind of intrinsic value, they carry a kind of mechanism with which to establish like political, economic, military connections, and alliances. So when we talk about the power of reciprocity, it's not always like, I'll give you a gift card and you'll give me, you'll make me something bad. Like, it's not as if it has like specific value all the time. It's definitely a symbolic thing, and we see that in Bedouin societies as well.
Yeah, it's not an economic exchange. It's, like you said, political, and it's cultural, and it dictates how their relationships with their other tribes. It prevents conflicts, and in instances where conflict, does arise, you can rely on your allies that you had positive exchanges or gift exchanges with in the past. So it creates these alliances. It tries to help keep the peace between different tribes, and this is Moss's central argument that. So that these gift exchanges are not economic. They're symbolic, they're political, and this mode of reciprocity dictates how their society is run through political and cultural, connections. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and even if it's not like, they were given the Kula ring, like bracelets or whatever, I found it particularly interesting that in Abu Lugod's research, it was even more like a nuanced cultural thing than that, because she talks in great detail about Hisham as their almost currency in interactions in terms of gift-giving reciprocity.
To kind of put it simply, women in their society are expected to fulfill the role of, the self-restrained mother of the family who takes care of the children until her daughters can marry and her sons can raise their own family. Mm-hmm. And Hisham is kind of a big part of this like bashful, self-restraint description that, women are supposed to embody. And in return for, fulfilling Hisham and having Hisham, the men in their lives will take care of, matters of money and matters of politics. And, it's not the same as in Moss's description that political connections are formed based on, the giving of gifts in the Kula ring. Mm. Like you said, it's a more nuanced way of looking at reciprocity within a society, and how they're, as long as, men achieve the gendered role that they are supposed to have and women achieve that through Hisham, then they are able to fulfill, like they're able to then go about their lives in a successful and relatively happy way,
Right. And I think kind of going back to that point we made at the very beginning of like, it's a very different kind of expectation of women's behavior than exists in the West. A big part of Hisham is, for lack of a better word, is shame. Where, for example, like deference to authority, whether that's your father or like a figure of actual political authority in your community. It's like shame in the company of the more powerful, I think, is how Abu Lugod describes it. And it creates this kind of code of modesty. And it's an incentive to behave in a way so that you don't incur shame on yourself or others. But I think that when we talk about women kind of feeling shame, as Westerners, there can kind of be this idea of like, oh, well, they're being shamed and suppressed and, treated poorly in their area. We have to fix this. We have to like save them, for lack of a better word, And
yeah,
it's not right.
I agree. It's very much, for us, we would see, or not necessarily for us, from the Western perspective, you would look at that and see those gendered relations in the terms of domination and subordination.
Right.
And those are the, specific words that Abu Lugod, kind of discusses in her work. But she then goes on to mention that for the women in the Bedouin society, their role in society as, deferring to authority to men is seen more in terms of protection and dependency. Mm-hmm. She specifically says it's a distinctive moral quality of reciprocal obligation and affection that characterizes these relationships of inequality. Mm-hmm. So, the women do recognize that they have less power, but they are doing so willingly.
Right.
And they are doing so to achieve success in their society, which is still equally as important as how we view obtaining success in our society to be. It's just different cultural and societal practices.
Yeah, and that's not to say that, abuse of women doesn't exist in the society, but it's not like this particular, I don't think, social structure is inherently abusive because, like you said, it's a voluntary kind of deference to a different part of the population in order to receive, benefits. You don't have to go out and fight. You don't have to, make money. You stay home and you play your part instead. And so to that point, we do have a clip that we would like to play.
Nobody I've ever met and worked with in these rural communities in Egypt or elsewhere ever envied Western women. They envied the lack of poverty that they thought existed. They envied certain kinds of things, but they were very happy to be Muslims. It was very important to them for their self-understanding, for their way of coping in the world. One of the ways.
What did you think of that clip?
I mean, I feel like we've kind of been discussing it.
Right.
It's like, from the beginning of the podcast, but it's important to reiterate because it is her central, purpose in writing this. And it's just important. I think what's specifically resonated with me and what I found most important is that, these women don't envy our way of lives.
Right.
So when you look at it from that way, we should not pity theirs because they're not asking for our pity. For them, this is their way of being fulfilled and their way of achieving status, just like we try to achieve status in our society through, whatever means makes us feel satisfied. And like they may look at us and envy, perceived lack of poverty. That was her specific example. But they don't wake up every day saying, I wish I could dress less modestly.
Right.
They wake up and they fulfill what they believe they should be doing on a daily basis, their tasks, because this is, again, what fulfills them. And I think that is, it's her book was more written to really help us understand a different culture that we otherwise wouldn't have. And it's really important to, with a long history of Western versus other weaker, worse cultures, it's important to continuously remind, Western readers to not view it in that way with our inherent bias that, we all have.
Right. Or that kind of superiority that, especially of Mauss's kind of generation of anthropologists kind of saw in other cultures that were not white or Western or wealthy. I also think a point that was interesting that we talked about, before the podcast was like, it's a way of achieving solidarity that we are not familiar with, but it's effective nonetheless. And, in class we've talked, like Dr. Grinker talked about how in every society it is so important to find a mechanism with which to build solidarity and consensus. And whether that's, in the Western world through, televised debate, or town halls or whatever, here, like, it's different, right? It's a willingness to kind of acquiesce. It's a willingness on the part of women to say, okay, you handle this, I'll handle this. And that doesn't make it barbaric. It doesn't make it antiquated. It's just different. And I think that you're right. This is a really important material to read and a really important society to understand, or at least attempt to understand, because it provides us with a different model for achieving consensus.
Yeah, okay. I think that was a really important point to leave off on, Victoria. I think you pretty much, with that sentence encapsulated our entire argument. We hope you found our comparison of gift giving in Mauss's, work and his description on it applicable and interesting in comparison to Abelugode's society. I think it, was a fascinating discussion, something that definitely could be talked about for longer than a 10-minute podcast.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.